first of all, thank you so much for inviting us to be here. It is a real privilege, and this is one of those occasions on which I'm really glad we're doing this online and we don't have to go outside and get our feet wet. As Mustafa says, I'm Dawn Edge, and I am a chief investigator for the CaFI trial. I'm really privileged to have worked alongside Pauline, and we're going to just talk you fairly quickly through the background to the study a little bit. And then Pauline is going to talk about the development of CaFI Digital and why it became a necessity. And then we'll look maybe at some implications. So CaFI stands for Culturally Adapted Family Intervention, and it was developed and piloted in Greater Manchester because of the long-standing history of research showing elevated incidence of psychosis generally, but schizophrenia in particular amongst people of African and Caribbean origin. So as you'll see there, the relative risk of if you're Caribbean of developing schizophrenia is about 9 times greater than for a white British person, and 6 times if you're white. If you're Black African. And I should really say at this point that when we're talking about people of African and Caribbean origin, the vast majority of people who are going to be accessing our services would self-identify as being Black British. Some of them have never been to the Caribbean or to Africa, and some will self-identify as being mixed or multiple heritage, but with an African ancestry. And alongside those elevated rates of diagnosis, we also have a long history of inferior access, experience and outcomes. So starting with how people get into services, much less likely to come into services via their GP, much more likely to do so through the criminal justice system or the Mental Health Act, so involuntary admissions, so 4 times more likely to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And then once in services, much more coercive care, so more likely to be held in seclusion, high rates of control and restraint, resulting in high rates of death from those control and restraint techniques, high rates of psychotropic medication, often forcibly injected, and worse clinical and non-clinical outcomes. So, for example, about 2.5 times the length of stay compared to a white British person as an inpatient. And all of these things obviously kind of add up to a care package, which is both inferior and at the same time much more expensive. The other thing, which is where our study comes in, is that there is a lack of access to psychological therapy, and the psychological therapy that exists isn't culturally informed. So it doesn't really take note of people's lived experience or different ways of conceptualizing what some of those experiences, these things like hearing voices, what they might mean in a cultural context. We chose to use family intervention, and we'll talk a little bit more about co-production, because it's a nice recommended intervention for psychosis. And you see here, alongside medication, so it's not saying that medication doesn't have a place, but patients' individualized treatment plan should offer them either family intervention or early access to psychosis care. Importantly, for family intervention, there's this line from the NICE guidance that says it's for service users in regular contact with their families. And I'm just going to give you a moment to think about who might be adversely affected by that in terms of being able to access this form of psychological therapy. So if you're a person who's been in the care system for a long time, you might not have access to a family. If you've fled conflict and you've arrived maybe as a minor and you don't know where the rest of your family is, you won't have access to your family. If your family have been lost through bereavement, you won't have access. So this is just one of the ways of just highlighting how systems and processes that are set up that on the surface seem very fair and make really good sense, that when you start to drill down, you can see that there's some potential hidden inequalities. Because of the time, I've just put on a page our journey to co-production. There's a lot of talk now about co-production and people with lived experience getting involved in designing services and co-producing research. If we're really honest, too often it's still a case of we design and we say to them, what do you think of this? And then kind of rubber stamp it. So this is a way of capturing, not all of it by any means, but some of the steps that we took in the feasibility study in terms of co-production. So starting at the very top with community engagement, where we asked people what their research priorities were, what were the things that we needed to do to shift the dial on what I said about that, the background of that long history of some people say overdiagnosis, but certainly high rates of diagnosis and that inferior care. And the things they said is that we want an alternative to medication, and we want better information. We want families to be better informed, particularly around things like their rights in terms of the Mental Health Act. But you'll see all the way through with people being involved as co-applicants in the research, so they co-created the research. There've been research advisory groups. They've been part of the trial oversight, and also all the way through in terms of the feasibility study, being involved in the dissemination, so co-authoring papers, attending conferences, as well as doing community events. So what is CaFI? It's 10 one-hour sessions of manualized therapy, and these, I'll just put them all up, these are the components. So all good therapy is going to start with engaging, whether it's an individual or as a group, and doing some form of assessment. But what came out of the co-production work, to take a standard model of family intervention and culturally adapt it, people were saying we need things that take into consideration different models of mental illness, different beliefs around that. So we built that into the assessment and into the manual. Probably the most standout thing to say on this slide is point 2, which is called shared learning. So in family therapy, there is a component which is called psychoeducation. You wouldn't be surprised to hear that people said you need to get rid of the word psycho altogether. And also, if we are going to say that this is a model that is co-created, that should be reflected in the ethos of delivery. And so having a shared learning model suggests that, or makes explicit, that the therapists need to learn from the families and the service users, as well as the other way around. Really important for this particular study population, where the components, the additional components around communication, and also services are set up, and the people talk about a recovery focus. What we were really keen to do is to make sure that that was really meaningful, and that took into consideration people's personal assets, the family assets, and also the communities in which they live, and how those can be brought to bear in therapy to help people to not only recover, but to stay well. I'm going to flick through this fairly quickly because I want to really get to Pauline's bit of the presentation. So one of the things that people told us is that as much as it's important to culturally adapt the intervention, actually, by far the most important thing is the therapist's understanding of people's lived experience, is their attitude that they bring to therapy. And so we did quite a lot of work in developing that and making sure it's within the manual. But also all of our therapists receive, and I put it in bunny quotes, the cultural competency, because it's not possible even in a couple of days of intensive training to make anybody culturally competent. What it does is to raise the awareness, but that's the language you see in text, so I've reflected it there. But really, it's a lot of the work we've done is to help people to identify one of the things that came up in the development work, which is around what people refer to as being the elephant in the room, which is the ability of the therapists and the families to talk about race and racism and discrimination, and how that's informed not just their journey into psychiatric services or psychological care, but actually their experience while they've been in there, and also in the therapy manual, writing in how people came from African and Caribbean backgrounds came to be in the UK in numbers, and really kind of giving some pointers about how important it is not to homogenize groups, and people don't do it deliberately, but we all have stereotypes and shorthands, right? So when we do this training and we ask people, if you hear the word Caribbean, what are some of the cultural markers of that? And people talk about things like music, and then they'll say reggae, and then they'll talk about food, and then they'll say rice and peas and chicken or curry goat. And I have to say to them, those are all Jamaican things. You know, talking about the Caribbean, if you were to go to Trinidad, for those of you who might have been, you're much more likely to be offered chapati and dal than you are to get jerk rice and peas and chicken, because there's a high proportion of the population that came from South Asia. So really just the training is about, and the manual is about giving people the tools to engage with people in a way that enables them to say, I don't know that. Could you tell me a bit more about that? And to come a bit from a position of real cultural humility. And we had to develop resources because they didn't exist. Happy to share the slide. This is afterwards. This is a short video about that, well, which I've just explained, of the feasibility study. We then got the funding. We went on the basis of the findings from the feasibility study. We were able to get funding from the National Institute for Health and Care Research to run a randomized controlled trial across England, so in the Northwest, Midlands, London, and the South of England. And this time, whereas in the feasibility study, we only worked with people of Caribbean backgrounds, this is now extended to people of sub-Saharan African background, because whilst we were doing that feasibility work, people were being referred who were from places like Nigeria and Uganda, or approaching us saying, why can't we have it? So we've done some further work to prepare the manual and so on, to further culturally adapt it. And the purpose of the trial is to evaluate the cost and clinical effectiveness of CaFI compared to usual care. And really importantly, we've embedded process evaluation, or implementation science it's sometimes called, because we know that although NICE recommend family intervention, it's got a really strong evidence base, it's very poorly implemented in the NHS. And even though at the moment NHS England are rolling out training nationally, because all families, with the caveat that I mentioned before, should be offered family therapy, it is still really poorly implemented. So that's some of the work that we're looking for. In relation to that, you know, people in regular contact with their families, what we've done is, borrowing a model that was used in New Zealand with Maori people, we tried it in the feasibility study, and it worked really well, which is, we first of all, if you're a service user and you want to take part in CaFI and you don't have access to your own family for whatever reason, you can nominate somebody that you trust. That could be your care coordinator or your team leader. It could be your youth worker or a faith leader, somebody that you trust to work with you. Where people don't have someone that they could nominate, we have recruited people with some minimal training, and then we assign them, well, we don't assign them, people get to choose from a raft of people to work with them in therapy, and that worked extremely well in the feasibility study. There was a whole other conversation about whether that's still family therapy or whether it's something else. We were due to open the trial in April of 2020, and you know what happened. So we were then faced with a trial which the study population we were seeing on our screens were disproportionately affected by COVID. Services were in lockdown. We couldn't go in and deliver the therapy, even if we were allowed. We couldn't do that. And so during that time, we took the time to work with Pauline and her team to develop CaFI Digital, and it has the additional benefit of potentially future-proofing the intervention going forward, and giving us more evidence about working digitally with people from minoritized backgrounds. So Pauline, it's over to you.
Thanks, Dawn. So I have a few slides about enabling the remote delivery of CaFI2, and I still remember the email from Dawn back in 2020 when she contacted me to say, we've got a problem on CaFI, can you help? And not unlike many other in-person trials that were happening at the time, obviously it became a big challenge to think about how can we move things that were supposed to happen face-to-face into an online environment. What I'm going to cover in the next few slides is really focused on one element of the remote delivery, and that's the website that we co-designed to support the CaFI trial. So next slide, please, Dawn. Thanks. So who are we? So we are the digital health software team at the University of Manchester. We're based at the Centre for Health Informatics, and we're a team of digital health researchers, technical architects, UX, UI designers, software engineers, project managers, and so on. And we build websites and mobile apps to support different kinds of health research, not just in mental health, although that's a particular area of focus for us, but in physical health as well. And we've been doing it for quite a few years now. So we became involved to think through with Dawn, how could we support the remote delivery of CaFI, and what steps did we need to take, and how could we work with all the various stakeholders to try and understand how we could move CaFI online, and how could we support the trial now that face-to-face interventions were not viable. Next slide, please. So a starting point for us for many of our projects is really with the NHS design principles, and you'll see there they generally make very good sense, I think, if you're starting a digital project, but thinking about how we put people at the heart of everything that we do. So co-design, patient public involvement, really putting that at the center of any kind of digital delivery. And thinking about how we designed for the outcome. So we did a lot of talking with Dawn, trying to understand what were the goals of the CaFI trial. As I mentioned, I was late to the party, really. I only joined as CaFI was struggling with the COVID challenges. And so we needed to understand what were we really trying to do in CaFI and how could we support it digitally. And then being inclusive, obviously that's right at the heart of CaFI anyway, but how could we enact that in the digital platform? And again, how could we design for context? And it was a very particular context, obviously, at the time in terms of COVID, but also thinking about the working conditions, particularly of the therapists. What kind of digital tools could they access? How would they engage with the website? Understanding that they had limited time, limited effort to learn a new system. Obviously, at the time, they were even more stretched for time than usual because of COVID and all the challenges around that. But thinking longer term about what are the challenges in their context and how could we design to support them best. And obviously designing for trust and testing our assumptions. Within our team, we tend to work in an agile way, and that fits very nicely with this design principle, which is about making, learning, iterating. So typically we build something, we might build a design prototype, then we take it to the people who are going to use it, we gather feedback, we iterate it, and we take it back to people and we get more feedback again. And really at the heart of everything is trying to do the hard work to make it simple. And as you'll see in the next few slides, keeping it simple and having a really straightforward interface and website was really at the heart of this. So all the feedback we got from all the stakeholder groups we talked to was really just keep it simple, make it as simple as possible to use throughout. So in terms of co-designing CaFI Digital, we were building the software collaboratively, building it, trying to get an understanding from the research team about what we were trying to do, but then working with the end users, and that was service users, families, carers, therapists, everybody involved in the project and everybody who would use the platform. And really trying to identify and respond to the needs of these different target groups. And obviously the therapists had one perspective on how the website should work. The service users and their families had a different perspective. We had different roles for them within the system, so they interacted slightly differently with the platform. And so trying to understand what their needs were and how we could respond to them digitally. We used a variety of different kinds of ways to engage in the co-design activities, from discussion and workshops, interactive tasks, prototyping, so building a design prototype, taking it to people, asking them to try it out, use some tasks on it, or give us some feedback from engaging with it. And right across the project, we were really concerned about accessibility, so trying to make the platform as accessible to as many different kinds of people as possible. Next slide, please. Okay, so typically, we use the government digital service in terms of user research and co-design, and there are 4 stages in that, starting with discovery, which is very much focused on the exploratory stages of the research, brainstorming with people, understanding their needs, identifying requirements, understanding really the details of the target users of the digital platform that we're building, and what kind of features and functions we might build in to achieve those kind of goals. For this project, we started really somewhere between discovery, which is the very exploratory stage, and alpha, which is where we're starting to build and test prototypes. Obviously, Dawn mentioned she'd already done a lot of work in feasibility study, understanding the needs of the target population and how this might work. So we already had a head start in some of the discovery work, and we were kind of somewhere between discovery and alpha when we joined the project. Inevitably, across all the user research and digital platforms that we build, we have a challenge, and that's that we always get more requirements than we have time and budget to deliver. So we usually end up with a huge list of requirements, and then we need to triage them. And I'll talk a little bit about how we did that as well in the next slides. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of the co-design activities, we had a couple of workshops with service users, and families and carers joined that as well. And again, as I mentioned earlier, keeping it simple was really the headline take-home message from all the workshops that we did. So just keep it simple, make it really straightforward to log on, make it really straightforward to access information, keep the messages on the page really simple, and so on. One of the other pieces of feedback we got was to make it work on different kinds of devices. And often when we work with young people for different kinds of interventions that we build, people tend to access the digital tech through their smartphones. With this particular population, there was a real range of devices being used to access the tech. So iPads were pretty common, as were desktops and laptops, which we don't tend to see quite as much in some other domains. But we needed to design for a technology that would work across all these different platforms. And making the content really accessible, really easy to read, not using complicated language, making it really straightforward to scroll through the different items and so on became really important. And we were also asked to make sure there was a diversity of representation, particularly in the images that we presented in some of the early workshops. Although we thought we tried to be diverse, actually we got some feedback that we needed more diversity in terms of some of the images that were being used in terms of age and gender, ability, and so on. So we worked on that in subsequent phases of the design. Visual impairments were highlighted as a particular problem in this population, so we were encouraged to use large font sizes by default. Obviously, people can increase the font sizes usually using the browser and so on, but again, keeping it simple for the particular population, understanding their needs, making the font size large by default saved people having to try and figure out how to make the screen sizes bigger and so on. And also offering training and support. And I suppose this again was, debunking the illusion that you build a digital tool and put it out in the world and it magically works and everybody can use it, no problem. But actually offering that training and support, having training tools within the digital platform, but also supporting people with external support as well. And for this particular project, we harnessed some of the digital navigator work that we've been doing at Greater Manchester Mental Health so that people had an in-person backup support to enable people to ask questions if they were getting stuck using the website or couldn't find materials or were just confused about it. So a kind of hybrid approach to this as well. Next slide, please. Thanks. And then in terms of the co-design with the therapists who would deliver CaFI, again, we had 2 workshops, and again, the headline message was really keep it simple. And for the therapists, one of the key things was that they wanted to be able to find the resources really easily so that they could then send them separately to the service users who were engaged in the trial and the participants in the trial so that they could find ways to just open a page, copy paste the link to it, and then put that in an email if they wanted to the participants as well. And again, therapists really wanted additional training and support, even though we were keeping it simple on the website, they really wanted to be able to follow up and have additional training via Teams, and also having a support contact if they got stuck, because sometimes the time period between the training and when they actually onboarded the initial participant, there was a bit of a time lag there. So having a way to contact us and get additional support was important as well. The therapist workflow in the website is more complex. So there was, again, that kind of highlights the need for training and support as well. And we also had some follow-on consultations with individual therapists. So trying to make sure the navigation was easy to use. It came out in the workshops that we did and some of the prototypes that we tested, people were still getting a bit confused about how to actually access some of the materials and making the resources easy to find and to copy paste to send on to service users. So we had some individual consultations to try and clarify that and make sure that we got it right. So what do we actually do in the co-design sessions? Well, a range of different tools and approaches, really. In the early phase workshops, we tended to have kind of brainstorming conversations about what are your thoughts about the project, and then we tended to use mural boards, basically a whiteboard where people can write things and write their thoughts, and using Post-its and so on. People might be familiar with it, but it's just another one of those interactive whiteboards, but quite handy for asking people feedback and having a way for them to contribute without having to verbally contribute if they don't want to. And then we ran some polls, so showing people prototypes that our designer Simon, who I think is on the call as well, designed. We would show prototypes of the website, and we'd ask people to respond to some polls. So to see if we got, for example, the images right and responded to the early phase feedback. Were the images diverse and inclusive? Had we got that right? Could people find their way through the different screens? Did they find the pages easy to read? Trying to respond to the visual impairment challenges that were noted early on. And again, in the early stages, trying to understand what devices people would most easily or most readily use to access CaFI Digital. And we also did some interactive tasks. So using a tool called Maze, which we use to test usability of the platform, we created some tasks for people to do. So for the therapists, could they find their way to a particular component for one of the sessions, for example, could they easily find that material and enable them to send it on to the service users? Was that possible? Thanks. As I mentioned earlier, one of the big challenges with any kind of digital project like this is that we end up with far more requirements than we can possibly implement, because we're always inevitably constrained by time and budget. So we use the agile Moscow prioritization method, which we tend to use across all the different projects that we work in. It's a very simple way to prioritize. It just says you identify what are your must-have requirements, what are your should-have requirements, what are the could-haves, the things that are nice to have, and what are the things that you won't have, so things that don't provide enough value to implement right now, might keep them on the backlog for later. And we tried to do this collaboratively with the service users and the therapists in the workshops, and then inevitably there were some decisions to be made outside those workshops in terms of how much technical effort it was to implement and design those features, and what kind of priority we were assigning to them. Next slide, please. Thanks. And as I mentioned earlier, so accessibility was threaded right across the project. We comply with the WCAG standards, which people are probably familiar with, but also thinking about how we embed accessibility right across the different stages of co-design, the different stages of user research. So early on in the exploratory sessions, we're really trying to identify what were the user accessibility needs, particularly around, in this case, for example, visual impairments, which we weren't aware of in advance. And then the alpha stages where we're bringing iterative design prototypes to people, trying to get feedback on those, seeing do we meet people's needs, or any things we've forgotten about or left out. And then taking that through to a beta phase, which we had, and we had the platform tested with service users and with therapists as well, and test the software and feedback to us about any defects or bugs or accessibility issues that they found. And obviously accessibility is an ongoing challenge, so we have ongoing routine checking of the platform and checking that we're still compliant with everything we said we would be compliant with. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. We do have a sort of short demo of a prototype of the website if people would like to follow up separately. I'm very happy to give that to people. We're not making it publicly available, obviously, because the trial is underway at the moment, but I'm very happy to walk people through a prototype at another time if that would be helpful. So I'll pass back to Dawn.
Thank you, Pauline. Thanks. Just see if I can get my video back on. It's not behaving. Okay, I think I'm there. All right, so we just thought that we've finished the presentation and then go into a discussion with yourselves, but I was just thinking about some of the implications for what we've just explored. So in kind of, from my point of view, in terms of the mental health inequalities, you know, this has been around a long time. So as far back as 2005, there was a delivering race equality in mental health policy, and that was supposed to be achieved within 5 years, and we're still here. NICE have been talking about culturally informed care. We're still here. In 2018, I was very privileged to be part of the Mental Health Act review, and there were a lot of these things came out around, you know, inequalities for different groups of people, and one of the things that we proposed, we recommended, so those of you who work in the NHS will know about the Workforce Race Equality Standard, the RES. And so we proposed a patient and carer race equality framework similar to reflect the RES. And we've been working on that. It's being piloted at the moment, and it's due for national rollout next year, but actually it's officially being launched next month. Happy to talk about that in another context. But also, you know, just for us to think through, you know, we write routinely, don't we? And I started off by saying we took an evidence-based model of family intervention and culturally adapted it. But so much of what we use in healthcare, in mental health care, is actually tested on a relatively narrow section of the population. A lot of our tools in psychological therapies are developed in North America, quite often with university students, disproportionately male. And there is a lot of work now to change that, but it's worthwhile just keeping that in mind when we're talking about the default of evidence-based and the need that the pressing need for us to actually extend the evidence base, including for things like cultural competency, where there's a lot of investment in trying to make services more culturally relevant and so on. But we haven't actually done the work to see whether that makes any difference, and the extent, importantly, whether it makes any difference to the people who are using those services in terms of their experiences and outcomes. Thinking about psychosis care and family intervention in particular, it seems intriguing, doesn't it, that we've just continued to deliver family intervention where it's available. I've mentioned that there's some real challenges, as though it was the 1940s, 50s, without any real consideration of what that means in terms of working with diversity and difference. And that's not just about ethnicity, I should say. You know, it was only last year that British Sign Language, the BSL, was officially recognised as a language in its own right. So without that, it means that in terms of service delivery, people who are deaf and have psychosis, what about their access to evidence-based care? What does evidence-based care look like for them? And what does culturally appropriate care look like for them? Especially when, you know, you've literally got a handful of therapists across the country who can use BSL. And what implications are there when therapy is mediated through a third or more parties involved in that and the interaction? The other thing for me that's really important, I've already mentioned the therapy partners, and thinking around what does family mean? Yes, a lot of these concepts are quite loaded and value driven, but in a modern world and the way where we live, we just need to go back again and think about what some of these things are and how they can so easily, unintentionally create barriers for access for some people. I think it's really important that we look at our training and supervision. Pauline was talking about the therapists and, you know, people needing more than one session to actually kind of get their heads around what is we've done all that work to make it simple and interactive, and people are still struggling. And I think that's really important for when we're thinking particularly of how much of the work that we're now doing and expecting service users to be involved in is actually online. We're moving more and more stuff online. A lot of the people that we've worked with have never, particularly at the older end, were not necessarily involved in using smartphones. They're not that confident. But even for people who are, we know that digital literacy is a real issue. And then we've also got, for some people, that literacy is an issue. And that's not just about people who have got English as a second or a third or a fourth language. It's for a range of different people who are overrepresented in mental health services, so people through the criminal justice system, care leavers. There are a whole load of people for whom we make assumptions when we send them online that they can read and write fluently, that they have health literacy and they have digital literacy. And I think those are things that we need to really look again. And also, I'm sure many of you will be aware that the NHS has got a psychological therapist workforce plan, but I also think we need to be thinking more creatively about how we genuinely work with people with lived experience to inform the way our workforce is structured and how we deliver care. Just a point about digital health and inclusion. So there is a national digital health and care strategy. Read to your heart's content. But actually, just looking at this, only 20% of NHS organisations describe themselves, and this is their description, as being digitally mature. 86% have a form of electronic patient record in place, whatever that might mean. Less than half of social care providers have any form of digital care records. So when we're talking about these things, it's really, really important to think about things like the digital divide with, also in terms of socioeconomic status. But if that's the state of the NHS, the people who are using the tools that we're developing to deliver care, what's the work that we're doing to make sure that they actually have the tools to be able to do so? So coming to a conclusion, I think for us, You know, we've tried to highlight the importance of genuine co-production, taking a kind of assets versus a deficits approach to working with people from where they are and what they can bring to the table. And so that becomes much more transformational as a process rather than just transactional, where you're going to get information from people. And that partnership working, you know, is kind of two-way, and it will involve some acknowledgement of power dynamics and genuine knowledge transfer. So one of the things that that Pauline's team have done is they've developed a group of people called digital navigators, and they're people who will work with service users and other people getting involved in research to help them with some basic understanding of how to navigate their way around technology. In CaFI, one of the things we've done is that we've taken on board, we've been very aware of the digital divide, and particularly in financially straitened times, not everybody has access to the internet, and even if they do, some people are having to make choices between food and heat. So, you know, paying for data is a whole other level, isn't it? So anybody who wants to take part in CaFI using CaFI Digital, we loan them tablets that are preloaded with data so that they can actually take part. It's very important for us to think about who's missing when we do this co-creation work. I've already mentioned people with deaf people, who, when we talk about language and translation, we're really often not talking about them. We're talking about spoken languages, and thinking about who are those folk whose voices and their way of communicating is not being heard. And then just the final thing, you remember that slide with all those arrows, that this is a journey, that we're all on it together, but we have to be intentional, and we have to call out the inequalities where we see them. And more often than not, they're just hidden in plain sight, and we just need persistence and to remember that this stuff costs. A lot of the work that we do, if anybody's involved in working in inequalities, it's so often the expectation is that we would do it for free on top of our work. When we work with service users, you know, it's making sure that they're properly remunerated for their expertise. And I have to say, in this regard, NIHR have been at the forefront of making sure that the people get paid for their time and their experience and expertise. So yeah, I think we're going to share these slides. So just acknowledging the people who took part in the pilot test got us to this point, all of the folk who've worked with us, including Pauline and her team, obviously, the funders, and then you have the slides so you know how to contact us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.